Emily Dickinson wrote a number of poems about death. And in those poems, she imagines death in a variety of creative ways. Of course, the question most students have is, why is she so preoccupied with death? Was she morbid or something? Well, maybe, but death is a significant preoccupation in a lot of 19th century literature. And we should remember that in the middle of that century, the Civil War was fought. It was the most violent and casually saturated war in history to that time. Most families were affected, so death was a constant presence. It's also helpful to remember that the 19th century world was a world without antibiotics. You could die from a sore throat. That just doesn't happen in our world. If you get a sore throat, you go to the doctor, and if you find out it's strep, you get a prescription of antibiotics and you go on about your business. You don't think anything of it. But in the world before antibiotics, that was serious. People died. They also died at home, which brought death closer to people. So for all those reasons, 19th century writers mulled over death a lot in their work. Of course, the standard image of death is a harsh one. The Grim Reaper most immediately comes to mind. Emily Dickinson, however, usually tries to think about death in creative ways. So with all that in mind as a background, let's read the poem and see what we can make of it. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Since then 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Well, clearly we've got some personification going on here. Death is a gentleman in a carriage. I'm interested in the words used to describe him. Kindly, civility. Obviously, this is not the Grim Reaper. This is a comfortable fellow to be around. I also think the first two lines are worth pausing over. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. It is true that we do get busy with our lives, and we've got schedules to keep and things to do, and we don't have time to think about death, let alone stop for death. But ultimately, death comes to get us, whether we've got time for it or not. Dickinson reminds us of this without being scary or morbid. The fire and brimstone preachers of the day spoke of death in a very threatening way, but not Dickinson in this poem. Death is just a nice carriage ride with a kindly fellow. Of course, it had to be a carriage ride because they didn't have cars when this poem was written. So they drove slowly, with no haste at all. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. So they're heading out of town. They go past a school where children are playing in fields of grain. Now that suggests it might be autumn. And we know that autumn is a universal symbol for the end of life and harvest time. We also see that it's about sunset. That's another universal symbol of the end of life. Morning symbolizes the beginnings of things. Sunset the end. So we've got all these symbolic suggestions here. Now, in the fourth stanza, we mix realism with surrealism. And that's a term that we may not have covered this semester. Surrealism is an artistic style that explores techniques that go beyond realism. In fact, sur is a prefix that means beyond. Usually, surrealism is associated with abstraction or violating normal expectations. We'll talk more about that when we get to some E.E. Cummings poems. So, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. The word house is surreal because it's not really a house. It's a swelling of the ground. And that suggests a freshly dug grave. It's also helpful to know that graveyards, or churchyards as they were more commonly known in the 19th century, were mostly out behind the church at the edge of town. So that brings this carriage ride into a little more focus. The roof was scarcely visible, obviously, because this residence is merely a swelling of the ground. The cornice is but a mound. A cornice is a decorative kind of molding at the edge of a roof or a ceiling. The word comes from the Italian word meaning ledge. Here's a picture. See those decorative things across the roof ledge? Those are cornices. But remember, we've got some surrealism going on in this stanza. This isn't really a roof, and that's why it's scarcely visible. The cornice is just a mound, a pile of dirt. Now, in the last stanza, we have a telescoping of perspective. We zoom forward in time. Since then, 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So the speaker, a dead person or spirit, is telling us of the death experience that happened centuries ago. The more time passes, the more time seems irrelevant. Each passing century seems shorter than the events of this day. I also like the use of the word surmised in the last line. To surmise means to make an educated guess. So at some point during this carriage ride, the speaker figured out what it was all about, that death had come for her, that those horses' heads were pointed toward eternity. I think the point of the poem is that death always surprises us. We're never quite ready for it, but it's not as scary as we think it might be. It's an interesting take on the subject.